Thank you for joining us. I'm Leslie Simon with the Humanities program here at UVU. Wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I'm here to tell you just a little bit about our program before I turn things over to Dean Danny Horns, who's to my left. So at the Humanities program, we have both a bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Arts degree, and starting this fall, a Bachelor of Science degree. And that's really exciting for us, really exciting for us, because what we're hoping that students will do, the degree just sort of takes out the language requirement of the humanities degree, although you can still learn languages if you want. And what we're hoping that students will do is they'll fill that in with some kind of minor that will invite you to apply what you're learning about art and culture and society to some specific field of knowledge that's of interest to you, and one that maybe to you feels more clearly career. Sort of like there's a sort of career path that's outlined for you. I know that's one of the things that sometimes people are worried about with humanities degrees. So things like medical humanities or business humanities or environmental humanities. And so that's the one we're here to talk about today. There is an environmental humanities program at the University of Utah, a master's degree. So we were hoping that we could kind of be a jumping off point for students in the state of Utah if you're interested in getting a bachelor's degree in that and then going on to pursue further studies. So today's symposium will feature interdisciplinary presentations on visual art, ecology, literature, and more, given by UVU students, faculty from UVU and BYU, and local artists and authors. The keynote address, scheduled for 11:30, will be given by writer, environmentalist, and educator Terry Tempest Williams. In this address, titled Wild Mercy, Williams asks, can we extend personhood to the Great Salt Lake, and what might a different kind of power look like, feel like, I lost that. And if we extend power to other species. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Integrated Studies, Departments of Political Science and History and Earth Science, College of Humanities and Social Sciences, College of Science, thanks Danny, Innovation Academy, the Center for Social Impact, Center for Study of Ethics, and of course our own department, Department of Philosophy and Humanities. So thanks for being here today. Dean Danny Horns will introduce our next speaker. Danny, if you don't know him, is, just really a pretty great person. So if you see him around campus, stop him and talk to him about what he's got going on. He is a geologist. He does consulting work in geology, and he's also, he's a dean here for us in the College of Science at UVU. He's been here for a long time. So I'm really glad to have him up here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I always think it's kind of a crack up to introduce the person who's here to introduce. So I am here to introduce Ben Abbott. And so first, like the basic bio, Ben is a local boy, product of Utah Valley. When he graduated high school and it was time to go to college, he traveled north to Utah State, where he did a bachelor degree in watershed science and earth science. Then when it was time for graduate school, he traveled further north to the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, where in the Department of Biology, he did a PhD focused on Arctic ecosystems. After he finished his PhD, his first postdoc was at the University of Rennes in France, where he held the title of Marie Curie Postdoctoral Fellow. It sounds pretty prestigious. After another postdoc, he landed at BYU, where he is an associate professor of environmental science and sustainability in the Department of Wildlife Sciences, or Plant and Wildlife Sciences, sorry. So that tells us about Ben's path to his faculty position. Doesn't tell us why he's here at an environmental humanities symposium. And to understand why he's here, we have to understand one of the great shortcomings of most of the scientific community. And that is, for the last several decades, as scientists, we have acted as if the ultimate product of our work was peer-reviewed publication, as if the ultimate audience for our work was other scientists. But we do what we do to benefit humanity. So the ultimate audience for our work is all of humanity. And we can't make any impact without communicating beyond the scientific community. And that's what Ben has become so good at. He is a leader in Utah at communicating environmental science beyond the scientific bubble. Most of his recent work has focused on Utah's two Great Lakes, Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake. For Utah Lake, he led the charge against the truly inane proposal to build islands in the lake that somehow was supposed to magically help the quality of the lake. And for Great Salt Lake, he was the lead author when the lake was really, the lake level was dropping, and we understood that drought is threatening the lake. He was the lead author on a report that had dozens of authors intended for a general audience, and that report was titled Emergency Measures Needed to Rescue Great Salt Lake from Ongoing Collapse. So between his authoring that report, his work in to protect Utah Lake, I'm confident that both of these lakes are under less threat than they would otherwise have been. So it's entirely appropriate that this environmental scientist is here at this Environmental Humanities Symposium to celebrate environmental humanities in general, celebrate the opportunity for students in the humanities program to focus on environmental humanities, where you in the future can help bridge that gap between environmental science and the rest of humanities. So with that, let's hear it for Ben Abbott.
Thank you very much, Danny, for that incredibly generous introduction. I am really honored and excited to be here with you today. And I love this view. I actually think this is that we should have all of our meetings in this room, where we can see what's at stake, the reason why we're here. Because when we begin with why, then we understand what we need to do. I've been asked today to give an overview of how Great Salt Lake fits in with the global decline of saline lakes. And I originally had a picture, a satellite image of Great Salt Lake as the beginning of this talk, but I've replaced it with this photo by Marianne Caron. Marianne is, in my opinion, the premier wildlife photographer of Great Salt Lake. And what captures, does anybody know what species this is? An avocet. What I think is so important about Mary Ann's work is how she introduces you to individual birds, not to species. And so here are 4 avocets playing in the lake, right? And it's this view, you realize we're not talking about biodiversity, or even the new term in ecology is decline of life on Earth. I like that term better. But we're talking about individual beings and families, right, that are coming from thousands of miles away to refuel and participate in this ecosystem that we are a part of as well. I would love to involve you in the conversation today, and I'm going to use this platform, Poll EV. So you can either scan the QR code, or if you just go to pollev.com and then enter the code BEN554. I'm super vain, so I used my name as the code. And the questions will just appear on your phone, and then you can respond. And they're kind of interspersed throughout the presentation. So again, if you didn't get it, it'll show up. It's just Ben554 at pollev.com. And the first question that I wanted to ask was, what do you think is the most important environmental issue? And answer in one word. I know that's hard, but it'll show up better in the word cloud. So this can be anything. Physical problem, biological problem, social problem. What do you think is the most important environmental issue? Climate change, air pollution, extinction, capitalism. So interesting to see here, you've already identified some consequences of the problem and some causes of the problem. Apathy, water, death, health, ignorance, complacency. Interesting. Humanity on there. That kind of gives me the shivers, especially at an environmental humanities conference, right? But thank you, and you can continue adding to that. If you were to ask me as an ecologist, here are what I think are the 4 most important environmental problems. The number 1 problem is harm to human well-being from environmental pollution. and I'll show you a figure on that. Number 2 is decline of life on Earth, the loss of other species in the Earth system. Number 3, disruption of Earth's great cycles. This isn't only carbon, right, which is driving climate change. It's also nitrogen, phosphorus, water. We have come to be the most powerful force in the Earth system. And then climate change. And there's a distinction here. Numbers 3 and 4, I care about primarily because how they impact numbers 1 and 2. Right? I care about Earth's climate because there are people and other life here. You know, Venus has a climate as well, and it's really out of whack if you've ever been there. But it doesn't have the same moral implications that climate change does in the Earth system, where our food, our water, our geopolitics, our individual lives depend on a stable, healthy climate. I wanted to show you this graph to justify that number 1 thing that I care about. This is a study by Isabella Arrigo published in Atmosphere a few years ago. She's comparing different risk factors for death, human death. There are about 60 million deaths every year. 1 in 4 of them is being caused by our unhealthy relationship with the environment, by the pollution that we're putting into the Earth system. Environmental pollution kills more people every year than all violence, malnutrition, and communicable disease combined. And yet when we wake up in the morning, I hazard a guess that this isn't the first thing that we're thinking about. Right? We might be worried about a car crash or coming late to the symposium, finding parking here. But this is the biggest thing. There is a myth that we can harm the environment and it's only going to affect some of God's children or people on Earth or life on Earth. But the first ecological law is everything is connected to everything else. And when we harm part of the system, it harms all parts. And we are parts of this amazing and glorious system. So this figure should not be interpreted to mean the things that are lower down on the list are unimportant. Right? Anything that is harming the human family and the web of life on the planet should be of concern. But I think we really need to prioritize our relationship with the environment. So another question for you. What is the biggest cause of these problems? You can respond for the one that you answered or any of these. And again, try to fit it in one word if you can. Ignorance, greed, industry, consumerism, stubborn people. I like how they ended up next to each other. Apathy, again, lack of action. Ego, interesting. And again, this is so neat for me to learn from you because often with different audiences, it's going to be specific actions that humans are doing. Here, we're talking about values and awareness. If we are now in the Anthropocene, the most powerful force in the Earth system, understanding our psychology, our communal decision-making, all of a sudden becomes really important. In fact, more important than Darcy's law for predicting groundwater flow. There was a paper by Dr. Lenton, I can't remember her first name right now, called The Hydrosocial Cycle. And she has this line that rocked my world. In the past, water always flowed down gradient, from high pressure to low pressure. In the Anthropocene, water flows toward money. Right, so we've rewritten the hydrological laws that are governing the distribution of water in the Earth system. I started, my bias as an environmental scientist and ecologist, I see 2 major activities that are causing these issues: dirty energy and unsustainable agriculture. But both of these problems, I agree with you, they're being caused by something deeper, by a loss of proper relationship with one another and with our home that supports all of us. And I am not the first person to make this observation, right? In the Barry Commoner, who some consider the most important environmentalist in the 1900s, he said, when any environmental issue is pursued to its origins, it reveals an inescapable truth, that the root cause of the crisis is not to be found in how men interact with nature, but in how they interact with each other. That to solve the environmental crisis, we must solve the problems of poverty, racial injustice, and war. So again, a complete collapsing of that separation between society and environment. Wangari Maathai, Nobel Prize winner, she says this in a way that I think is even more powerful, because she emphasizes, when something bad goes wrong, it harms the whole system. When something good happens, those positive ripples pass through the whole system. So she says, we are called to assist the earth to heal her wounds, and in the process heal our own. Indeed, to embrace the whole creation in all its diversity, beauty, and wonder. This will happen if we see the need to revive our sense of belonging to a larger family of life. Isn't that amazing? I deeply believe that we are all needed to face these problems, and that while they can be absolutely intimidating and oppressive and make it hard to get up in the morning, they also can be the thing that gets us up in the morning and gives us meaning and helps us heal the anxiety and isolation and hopelessness that so many of us are suffering from. We have a local example. The presiding bishop of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints said this in our general conference. The care of the earth and of our natural environment is a sacred responsibility entrusted to us by God, which should fill us with a deep sense of duty and humility. It is also an integral component of our discipleship. And many people have observed that perhaps the most important theological change going on right now is religions around the world recognizing the importance of environmental stewardship as part of their mission and starting to act and teach about that. So this view is very different. I took a sustainable development course. It was the one business class that I ever took. And this is the model that I was shown. That you have the economy, environment, and society. And sustainable development happens where there's overlap between those circles. Right? I understand the reasoning behind this, but this also makes no sense from an ecological perspective. And instead, this is the ecological view, where we recognize that all of human society is nested within the Earth system, and that the economy is actually only part of what we're trying to do in human society. So it's a hierarchical model. And there's interesting research and movement on this, even organizing the Sustainable Development Goals in this nested framework. Okay, you are all now certified ecologists. Let's talk about this issue. You could think of it as a murder mystery. Right, the satellite images started the year that I was born, just by chance. That's when the Landsat mission was launched. And so we can see in real time the lake disappear. And if we look at the statistics, the reason why in the report that Danny mentioned, we didn't call it the potential collapse of Great Salt Lake or the near-term collapse of Great Salt Lake, it's the ongoing collapse of Great Salt Lake. Right, the lake has lost 2/3 of its surface area. It's lost 3/4 of its water. It's already gone. And this is what you can see from a satellite. What you can see with the high precision GPS tells an even worse story. I'm sorry that I'm smiling at this, but it's also, I think that it is extraordinary that we can see this in real time. Because it used to be one of the biggest challenges was helping people understand what was going on. And when you can see it, then you can start to imagine what we need to do to change it. Right? So I actually think it's extremely positive that we know how far along in the collapse we are. There was a team a couple years ago that placed these high-precision GPSs all around the valley. The project was initially focused on something else, but they noticed that their little GPS stations were moving ever so slightly, and they were moving upward and outward. And the reason why they were moving is because the Earth's crust is actually floating in the mantle. And if you remove mass from the Earth's crust, then, just like a boat, it floats up a little bit more. And so they were able to estimate by how much the Earth's crust had deflected, how much mass had been lost from the Great Salt Lake system. That was the epicenter of where the Earth's crust was rebounding the most. And their estimate was actually 3 times higher than the amount of water we've lost from the surface. So where is that water that's no longer there? Anybody have an idea?
Beneath the surface.
Beneath the surface. This is groundwater loss, right? One of the reasons why the lake saw such a precipitous decline from 2000 on, 2020 on, is that we had lowered groundwater levels around the lake, right, which was previously flowing into the lake, and then this hasn't been demonstrated yet, but we think those hydraulic gradients were reversed, and so the lake might have started losing water through the ground. So the problem is at least 3 times worse than it looks. I want to ask you a values question. Why can't we let Great Salt Lake die? Why must we save Great Salt Lake? And this one you can use more than one word. But why for you did you show up here on a Tuesday to talk about the lake? 2 P words, one positive, one negative. A marketing expert told me the other day there are only 2 motivations, right? Love and fear when it comes to marketing. So we've got both of those here. Posterity. We've got to leave something better for those who come after. And also fear. Because if we trash Great Salt Lake, then we're looking at clusters of cancer and Alzheimer's and virtually every system in the human body. Community future. I want my kids to see the beauty of it out the airplane window. It is pretty extraordinary. I mean, the airport's in an awful place, right? It's in the actual footprint of the lake, where the lake wants to be, but it gives you amazing views. And so maybe that's a benefit in the long term, right? Because everyone who comes here sees the lake. Humanity and nature. I love that those 2 ended up next to each other. Right, remember, we are part of nature. And I hope that all of us leave the conversation today recognizing we are not an inherently or even predominantly negative force in nature. In fact, we have to, as Wangari Maathai told us, we have to step into that role to be positive actors. Okay, penguins. I want to hear the story about that, whoever... I know that there are occasionally flamingos on the lake, but I haven't heard about penguins. Web of life, hope. Okay, this is fabulous. Again, feel free. I will look at all of these. There are 3 kind of categories. When I think of the stakes of losing the lake, first, human health, second, biosphere integrity, and third, the economy. And this contrast of images, right, of the Great Salt Lake Valley during a good air quality day, and then during a dust storm coming off of Great Salt Lake, I think makes it really clear. And while there have been a few estimates of how much it would cost, for example, to try to stabilize the dust, there has been no estimate of the indirect impacts of the loss of Great Salt Lake. No one has dared to say, if property values decrease by 5 or 10%, for example, as this becomes increasingly a source of toxic dust, what does that number look like? And sometime that'll be done, but we know it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And money, of course, is a really poor way of estimating impact, but it is a way. This is what the snowpack is supposed to look like. This is from the top of Big Baldy in the front of Timpanogos. Increasingly, this is what our snowpack looks like. This is research done by Dr. Mackenzie Skiles at University of Utah. She found that in 2022, Utah's snowpack disappeared 17 days earlier than it would have, because of the deposition of dust on the snow, right? That darkens the snow, it melts out faster. 17 days is not some marginal thing. Imagine if you were a farmer trying to irrigate your crops and the water stops 17 days before the end of the irrigation season, right? Imagine if you are a phalarope that's flown hundreds or thousands of miles and the brine shrimp collapse 17 days before you get there, or even 17 days before you've refueled and left, right? This is a really big change. And that gets us to the second issue, the decline of life, right? The threat that this is to the 250 bird species that depend on the lake. 12 million birds come through the system, migratory birds each year. This is an eared grebe. And again, we're not just talking about a number of birds, we're talking about individual beings who are here, who are looking at us with these intense eyes. You know, we depend on this, but you are the ones in charge. And then this, does anybody know what this is?
Is that the salt flats?
So it's not the salt flats.
Mineral extraction.
So mineral extraction. These are evaporation ponds. And this is literally a picture taken out the window of a plane a few years ago. The color comes from life, different microbial communities that are there. And I think that this is an amazing testament that actually brings me a lot of hope. Even in this act of extracting minerals from the water, you still see life as irrepressible. It still is there all the way to the end. So as the water flows through, it gets saltier and saltier. The algae can no longer survive. So you only have these halophiles, salt-loving bacteria that are there. Doesn't mean we don't want the whole lake to be pink, but it is pretty amazing. From that salt come a lot of things that we depend on. This is from Brian Steed, the Great Salt Lake Commissioner. The thing that all of these products have in common is they come from Great Salt Lake. So the potash extracted from the lake is the highest quality potassium fertilizer in the country. It's used to support most of California's stone fruits and nuts. About half of the world's table shrimp supply depends on brine shrimp harvested from Great Salt Lake. When the shrimp are super tiny, really shrimpy shrimp, they have to eat even shrimpier shrimp to get through that phase. And then Great Salt Lake is the only source of magnesium in the United States. And magnesium is used in every type of aluminum alloy and titanium alloy and all of these things. So from aerospace to our phones to the critical minerals that we need for the renewable energy transition, Great Salt Lake is a real economic linchpin. So now that we all love the lake, as if you didn't before, what is causing the collapse? And actually, I love this picture because it shows the entire watershed. You can see not only the lake, notice the north half already is lost, just like those mineral extraction ponds. It's become too salty for algae, and only those halophilic bacteria can survive. There are no brine shrimp. There are no brine flies. There are none of those migratory birds. There aren't even pelicans there anymore. So we can see the lake, but we also can see the watershed. The most beautiful lake in the state, sorry, Terry, is Utah Lake, which is down there. So if we look at this picture and we think, what is causing the lake to decline? What's causing its loss? I want to give you a quiz. So here are 5 options. And there are absolutely multiple contributors, but I want you to pick the main one. What do you think the biggest contributor is to the decline of the lake? Okay, 5 more seconds. Okay. Urban expansion and irrigated agriculture are coming out on top, and then drought, climate change, fracking. Pie charts are the highest form of science communication. And so here's a pie chart that shows the breakdown of the consumptive water use in the watershed. So agriculture directly accounts for about 3/4, but also because most of the water that we're keeping in reservoirs and moving through canals is going toward agriculture. I often will group that together with reservoir loss, and I think about it as a 80-10-10 split. So we got 80% of the consumptive use is agricultural, about 10% for cities, about 10% for mineral extraction. Now, climate change is contributing as well. It's making this harder. It's estimated that by around 2050, we'll have about 15% less runoff than we do currently. All else held equal because of climate change. Precipitation is actually expected to increase, but evapotranspiration increases faster as things get hotter. Anybody surprised either by the pie chart or by the fact that it's primarily human water use? I see a few shaking heads, a few nodding heads. It's really interesting to me. I'm going to ask you another question. How much do we need to reduce consumptive water use to turn around the lake's collapse? So what should our target be? Do we need to have a water tithing system? We reduce by 10%. Do we need to be thinking all the way up like an 80% decline or somewhere in between? Okay, 5 more seconds. All right. Nice work, everyone. The majority got this right. It's about 30% to 50%. And the reason why there's a range is because we don't know what the climate's going to do exactly. We don't know what the weather's going to do. If we get a slightly wetter climate scenario moving into the future, then maybe we only need to reduce it by a third. If things are more like they have been since the year 2000, then we need to reduce our consumptive water use by half. And we came up with this number by looking at the historical behavior of the lake. Right? How much water does it need? On the top, you've got the water from the 3 main tributaries to the lake. And then we looked at time periods where the lake elevation was going up, and there's a pretty clear threshold. If the lake gets 2.5 million acre feet or more of water, then it goes up. If it gets less than that, then it goes down. It's actually relatively simple hydrology. A 30 to 50% decrease in consumptive water use is a lot. Right? Like we can take 30 to 50% shorter showers or fewer showers, but that actually doesn't impact it because the water that we shower with goes into the drain and most of it gets back to the lake, 90% or more. So what are we talking about? We're talking about reducing outdoor water use. In cities, this is our lawns. In farming, this is irrigated agriculture. And this is a global pattern. This is a really important paper by Wine and Lerone that came out in Earth's Future a couple years ago. And the title, I think, is pretty arresting. In water-limited landscapes, an Anthropocene exchange, trading lakes for irrigated agriculture. So we've made a decision. And it hasn't been one person, Spencer Cox, declaring we're going to trade Great Salt Lake for agriculture. This has been a cultural decision that's evolved and emerged over many, many decades. But the observation that Wine and Lerone make is that when the ratio of irrigated acreage in the watershed exceeds the area of the saline lake, then, when that's greater than 1, you end up in structural decline for that lake. This is a picture from the Aral Sea. And so if we look at the Great Salt Lake watershed and do that ratio, how much irrigated land is there, how big is the lake, we have a value of 2. So we've leveraged the system by 100%. And again, that gets us back into that range of a 30 to 50% decline in consumptive water use is what we need to restore the lake. So how is it going so far? I want you to assess, what do you think the trend of water use is in the watershed? Is it going up, going down, staying the same? And here we'll have a little peer pressure. I'll show you the responses live. Okay, 2/3 say it's increasing, 11% decreasing, 23% that it's stable. Okay, well here's what population is doing. This is from a preprint by Merck and Tarbotten. So population is increasing a lot, right? My parents had 7 children. I have 4 children. Most of that population growth is domestic growth, right? Anybody from California here? Okay, we got a few hands, right? Some of it's also people moving here. So water use must be exploding, right? And in fact, if you talk with the water conservancy districts, they often assume that. And yet, if we look at the trend through time of consumptive water use, it is not increasing. It peaked in the late 1990s. And it goes up and down each year. We have better measures. So that the reason why the curve gets more jagged is we know much more precisely how much water is being used. Clearly for most of us that is news. The narrative, even at the Museum of Modern Art in Salt Lake, their exhibit starts out with, as Utah's population explodes, we're facing this water crisis. But this is actually a crisis a century in the making. It was in the mid-1900s that we started using too much water. Not for people directly, but mainly to grow feed for livestock. And if in this same paper, they reconstruct what the level of Great Salt Lake would be, if not for those diversions. And the answer is the lake is 15 feet lower today than it would be if not for these diversions. So the lake would be not only in the healthy range, it would actually be right at the top of the healthy range according to our current values, right? The lake is perfectly happy at that level and higher than that level. But because we put the airport there and because we put all of our wetlands in impoundments, it makes it difficult. Okay, so this is a watershed-wide problem caused by overuse of water, primarily agriculture. Let's see what we can learn from other places around the world about solving this. Anybody recognize this body of water? The Caspian Sea, the largest lake in the world. And you can kind of gauge the difference. This is also taken from the International Space Station. You can gauge the difference in size by how much of the curvature of the Earth you see. Isn't that incredible? I mean, this an incredible water body. So how many of these large saline lakes are there globally? These lakes only occur in closed basins, right? So if you're in a wet area, the water fills up and will eventually cut a channel to the ocean. So these are only going to occur in arid and semi-arid regions. How many of them are there? Okay, 15, 30, 60, 120. We're taught, I think, here that Great Salt Lake is an uncommon ecosystem, right? Very, very rare. And yet there are about 120 of these large saline lakes worldwide. What about how much of global lake water? So if we take all the freshwater lakes and saltwater lakes, what percentage occurs in these saline lakes? Okay, so people are up maybe 25%, a quarter of the lake water. The answer is a half. Half of the world's lake water occurs in these saline lakes, which is an amazing paradox as well. Again, if we're thinking they're occurring in these arid and semi-arid regions, then how is there so much water there? Well, they're finely tuned. They have a very delicate hydrological balance because what keeps the lake from flooding? There's only one place for that water to go. I see we can all point up, right? Evaporation. And so at times, right now, if we went back only 20,000 years, a blink in geological time, we'd be under 300 feet of water here, right? In the endorheic lake that we know now as Lake Bonneville. So these lakes are very, very sensitive. They can accumulate large amounts of water, but they can also lose a lot of water. Situation where our unique mismanagement of this ecosystem is trashing it, or is this part of a broader system? So how many lakes are there, large saline lakes are there worldwide? 120. So you can think about what percentage of those. I put 130 on there just as a trap. Okay. So 90 or 110 are the most common answers. The answer is around 110 of the 120. Almost all of them. This is what this looks like worldwide. And the colors represent the percent of the lake area loss. And notice how many of these lakes are in the 88% to 100% loss. So this is not an isolated problem. This is actually one of the most important unsolved ecological problems of the Anthropocene. And because these lakes are occurring in these semi-arid regions, they are islands of water and life. And so it's very common that you have large populations of migratory birds that can only make it between their temperate homes in the northern and southern hemisphere thanks to leapfrogging across these lakes. So what have people tried? If this is an unsolved issue, and I should just be even clearer, there are no examples, there are 0 examples of any of these large saline lakes after they slip into decline being restored. So we have a batting average of 0. Here's Lake Urmia in Iran is often considered the best analog of Great Salt Lake, similar size, similar climate. They blamed the weather. They said the lake is declining not because of water use, it's declining because things are getting hotter and we've had a drought. And lo and behold, the lake actually refilled a couple years ago, about halfway. And then it disappeared 2 years later. Because the weather's going to do what it's going to do. And because these are closed basins, if you get a couple of big wet years, they absolutely can go up. But that doesn't solve the long-term decline. It's just like your bank account. If you're counting on an occasional infusion of cash from your father, as I often do, to balance the books, that's not a place of financial security, right? If you're spending more than you're getting in. In the Aral Sea is the largest of these lakes that's been completely lost. 95% of the lake is gone. And in the Aral Sea, they decided, rather than trying to live within our means, let's re-engineer the lake. We'll just cut it in half. And it stands to reason. If you cut it in half, let the other half dry off, you have less evaporation, so you need less water to maintain the level of the lake, right? It seems like an okay path until you realize, where is the precipitation in the watershed coming from? Partly from the ocean, but by the time you get to these inland areas, the water has fallen from the sky and re-evaporated from the land surface an average of 7 times. And so, just like here, the evaporation from Great Salt Lake doesn't disappear. It's a source of downwind rain and snow. And here, when they lost half of the Aral Sea, all of a sudden precipitation in the whole watershed declined because they didn't have that hydrological loop. So there's demand side and supply side hydrological thinking. We are losing 106 gigatons of water a year from these endorheic basins. That's 66 cubic miles of water. That helps me visualize it. So go for 3 marathons, and you've just traced one line of a cube. That's how much water we're taking from these inland terrestrial systems and exporting to the ocean. It's so much water that it's the second largest cause of sea level rise after the melting of glaciers and ice caps. It's so much water that we have actually deflected the tilt of the Earth because we've moved mass from up high on the continents down to the ocean. And the impacts, again, are absolutely devastating. This is a 300-mile-long dust plume coming from Mar Chiquita in Argentina. Very similar lake. Again, many of the birds that we know here in the summertime go to Mar Chiquita in the the wintertime. And then, of course, pictures from the Aral Sea, just showing the amount of cultural devastation that can happen. In the case of the Aral Sea, the heavy metals and toxins from the dust were concentrating in the tissues of the people and other organisms that lived around the lake, to the point that there was a public health announcement recommending that mothers no longer nurse their children because of the accumulation of those toxins. And so there is no separation between the health of our home and our personal health. If we are interested in staying here, which I am, more than interested, I'm committed, this is where I am staying, then we have to take care of our home. And this, I especially like this picture. This is from the Salton Sea. And it shows the deposition of dust on the agricultural fields that are causing the decline of the lake, right? So you can see that cycle. We have to live within our means. And so there's this question of, are terminal lakes terminal? And I want to ask you, what do you think the likelihood is that we save Great Salt Lake before its food webs collapse? Because the lake doesn't just gradually die, right? The salinity gradually increases, the level gradually goes down, but the life inside the lake has thresholds, just like our bodies, right? If you cool us off 1 degree Fahrenheit, we can deal with it. Another degree, same amount, all of a sudden we're hypothermic and shut down. So what do you think, what's the likelihood that we save the lake? Okay, well, we're spread out. I'm glad to see that we have at least one person that said 90%. 25% is the most common response. So 1 in 4. Wow. This risk assessment maybe explains why there already are major insurance companies that are redlining portions of the Wasatch Front, meaning that they won't provide insurance for homeowners there, because they recognize because this and other environmental issues, it's not economic anymore. Well, I was in the 5 or 10% round until last year's winter. And this is a picture that I took in May, up in the mountains right after another snowfall. We had no chance. We were up against that threshold. The salinity in the south half of the lake was 18, 19%. The brine flies already couldn't reproduce. That's half of the lake's food web, right? We had no chance. There's nothing that we could have done. That big winter did not solve the problem, but it gives us a couple of year window where we can implement a solution. It gives us a fighting chance. And maybe that chance is only 25%, as the group here thinks. Maybe it's a little higher, maybe it's lower. We don't know, right? When you are the first, you don't know what the likelihood of success is. And we have to be the first, right? We have to be the first community that turns around the decline of the lake. And like we were talking about, I think that this is the crisis that we need. The crisis that can help heal divides in our community, that can heal the hurt that so many of us are feeling. Now, where did most of this snow go? The Great Salt Lake Commissioner told us. And I love it. He took a graph that was from a more technical report and doctored it up and annotated it so it was easier to understand. 1.6 MAF, what does that stand for? Million acre feet, 1.6 million acre feet, the biggest increase ever in the amount of water in Utah's reservoirs. Our infrastructure is really good. Our water infrastructure is super efficient. We were able to capture that snow, store it in our reservoirs for future human water use. It's an engineering marvel, right? But it's a nightmare for the lake that was sitting there with its mouth open like a baby bird for this infusion of fresh water. And when we look at how much the lake level came up, there was a lot of news coverage about 5.5 feet, right? But that was only the south arm of the lake. It's only half of the lake. If we look at the whole lake, it came up just over 3 feet. And the normal amount in an average water year for the lake is to come up 2 feet and go down 2 feet. So we barely got more than an average water year. We'll probably see more increase in lake level this year than last, even though it was a much smaller snow year, because our reservoirs are full. Right, so we've got to, we're actually letting water through the Jordan River right now. We even flooded some houses. And I'm very sorry if you are one of those people that live in those houses, but I think that this is really interesting, right? We said we're willing to accept some inconvenience and even damage to let water get to the lake. Now, we didn't really choose that. We have to, otherwise we'd overtop the reservoirs when it starts to snow. We need to start making those decisions voluntarily. When I grew up, I was shown this Mormon ad. Does anybody else see this? You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to. We can just talk afterwards. So, I love this picture. It was very, very effective. The idea is, if there is some action that you don't want to take, we'll call it a sin in our community. You don't want to get up close to the sin, right? You don't want to say, okay, how close can I get to the line? That line used to be clearly Diet Coke, right? Now we've accepted Diet Coke. We have it even at BYU. The line's moved a little bit. But here, we right now are living on the edge. We are waiting for the wind, for a big snow year to push us back away from the edge. And we've got to move our chair away from the edge. And the only way to do that is to live within our means. And this is a fabulous book by Rhett Larson called Just Add Water. He's a legal expert on water, global water issues and global water security at Arizona State University. And maybe I just like him because he looks like one of my youth leaders who was telling me to stay away from the edge. But there are 3 steps to water security, and they are prioritized. Number 1, understand water. Take the measurements that you need to understand how much is sustainably available. Understand the people that are using the water. Why are they using it? Why are we growing so much alfalfa in Utah, most of which goes outside of the watershed? Well, big part of the answer is the Farm Bill. Right? We're subsidizing animal agriculture. So there are way more cows and pigs that want to eat that alfalfa. We're using taxpayer dollars to subsidize the growing of an unsustainable crop in the watershed that's trashing the lake. Right? That change in policy. So understand the water. Why is it flowing where it's flowing? Number 2, conserve water. Conservation is always more cost-effective and more resilient than augmentation. And then number 3, when absolutely necessary, augment water, meaning bring it in from somewhere else, figure out a new source. But the reason why these are prioritized this way is at the top, this is preventative, it's scalable, it's efficient, it's resilient. There are co-benefits to this. Co-benefits mean other good things that happen when you do it. On the other hand, when we're augmenting water, it is reactive, less reliable, more costly. It's often counterproductive. Another solution that they tried to implement with Lake Ermia was piping in water. Right? Tried that with the Aral Sea as well. And then there are real trade-offs there. Now this thinking comes from a law professor, but we see the same idea in ecology. This is Palmer and Stewart, really important paper on ecological restoration, where they prioritize this range. On the left is where you want to be, conservation. Protect what is there. If you've degraded it, try to restore it back to what it was. The highest form of restoration is building islands in a lake, But if you can't do that because of the wacko environmentalists that hate progress, then put it back the way that nature intended it, right? You can reduce impacts if it has to stay changed, right? Here's a park in an urban area. You may not be able to put the old growth forest back there in that environment, but try to make it serve multiple things. And then if you can't do any of that, mitigate it. So create something else in another area. The reason why this again is prioritized is because on the left, it's less effort and more likely to succeed. On the right, it's more effort, more costly, and less likely to succeed. And I like to think about this again from an environmental humanities perspective. What are we trying to change along this spectrum? On one side, we're trying to change society, right? And on the other side, we're trying to control nature, which for those of us who watch Jurassic Park, we know always works out. So I love, again, this picture. This is a western snowy plover just learning how to catch the brine flies, so hungry. Well, it's running, right? How are we going to grow the flow by 1 million acre-feet in the time that we need to? It is a race. And you might have heard some politicians and even managers liken it to a marathon. Has anybody heard that analogy? This is a marathon. It took us 40 years to get here. It's going to take us a long time to get out of it. There is some truth to that. But this has to be a marathon that starts with a sprint, because we are so far behind. The lake is mostly gone. Right, so we've got to think like the plover and run really fast. After we've caught a few of those flies, then maybe we can get into a more sustainable rhythm. But right now we need an emergency rescue. And I showed this figure to a group of farmers a few months ago. And it was really interesting to hear their reaction. This was the way that I originally had the slide. I said, this is not a question of whether we save Great Salt Lake, because we're going to. We have to change our society. Again, too much is at stake. This is a question of whether we do it the easy way or the hard way. And so the easy way is cooperative and compensated transition to low water agriculture. Some of this is agricultural optimization, but that only gets us 15% of the way there, even if we were using the best practices of precision agriculture. So it's going to have to also include things like transitions to other crops, or temporary or permanent fallowing of fields, a decrease in the area of irrigated agriculture. Now, there are plenty of rain-fed crops that we could grow here if we got some of the political and economic things set in the right direction. So it doesn't mean an end of agriculture, but it means an adaptation, right? Proactive participation in water markets. There's been a huge investment on the state side to allow farmers to swap water rights. Could be a really helpful tool. And I was really, really optimistic about this. When we got the kind of 2 years in update, only 4 farmers had taken advantage of the program. 2 of those farmers swapped water that ended up saving some water. 2 of those farmers swapped water that ended up consuming more water. So it was a total wash as a program as a whole. This doesn't mean that it's a failed path, but we've got to be really agile. And here's where we need some business majors and others who are thinking about how can we make sure our response is big enough and it happens in time. Now, if we take the hard way, then we're going to deny that there's a problem. We'll blame one another, right? The farmers are blaming the cities. The cities are blaming the farmers. Everybody this year, if you follow the legislative session, blamed the mineral extraction industry. It's all their fault. They're not playing by the rules. What percentage of the consumption are they causing? 10% if you include the losses of conveying the water, right? They have a role to play, but even if they didn't exist, it wouldn't solve the problem. But the farmers they gave me some really good feedback, because this is not a good figure. We need to change it. We're really talking about a hard way and a harder way, because nobody has done this. Even with Mono Lake, you had one major water diversion. You had a public trust lawsuit, right? It was really clear who Mr. Burns was, sitting up by the nuclear power plant, right, destroying the lake. And they didn't restore the lake. They simply slowed its decline. It's more than 10 feet below its legally required level, right? And I love that idea of legally requiring a lake to do something, right? The lake doesn't respond to the number of bills or podcasts or symposiums that we have. It responds to the amount of water that gets to it. So let's look at what we're doing right now. Here are some solutions that have been proposed. Last year, we actually put about $10 million toward cutting down trees in the watershed. And the reasoning was trees are transpiring a lot of water. If we cut them down, you'll get more runoff. It doesn't matter that that's not what the science says. It sounds really good, right? So we did a pilot project where this guy took 2 bulldozers and put a giant cable between them and just tore down trees. And it was done in a totally unscientific way with no baseline. We couldn't even quantify whether it made a difference. He concluded, because there was a lot of runoff last year, that it probably worked. The second one that probably gets the most attention, a pipeline from the Pacific Ocean. Right. Rob Sobey at BYU did the calculation. He's a hydraulic engineer. And he said, how much energy would it take? Like, let's set everything aside. How much energy would it take? The answer is hundreds of millions of dollars of energy every year, around 11% of Utah's total energy demand, just to run the pipeline. And that's after you have to desalinate the water, because salt water would trash the lake. So the Bear River development is the next one, right? And this is one that we should shake our head at. This is the idea that building another dam is going to help the lake, that will hold more water. Right? If we had the Bear River development, then much less water would have gotten to Great Salt Lake than it did last year. This is a huge success story, though, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. Cloud seeding. Cloud seeding is an experimental technology that has not been demonstrated to increase precipitation, and yet we're all in. We've got stations all over the state. And in our defense, we are not the only ones. Colorado's doing it. Nevada's doing it. Montana, everybody is doing it because it's quite cheap. All you have to do is spew some silver pollution up into the atmosphere, and it maybe increases in that local area a little bit of snow. The causeway, right? In 1959, we built a causeway across the lake that cut it in half. We're now using the causeway. We've rechristened it. It's now the Adaptive Management Berm, which allows us to push water up to the north with the salt that it contains in an effort to protect the south. Now, that maybe is justified on a really short-term basis, but it's a slippery slope. And we can end up like the Aral Sea really fast. And there already is a proposal and legislative changes that have been made to make it easier to dike the lake again. So let's cut the lake in half again, right? My favorite one, though, is this idea we're going to use fourth-generation nuclear, and we'll put it on trucks like this, to pump and desalinate groundwater, and then use that to refill the lake. And the idea is not viable, but it just brings me a lot of joy. Like, we have two options. We could use less water, or we could invent a new technology, put it on a semi-truck, and then pump water that we can't see to refill the lake. And the obvious answer is that one. Like, that's what we should be doing, right? And then the proposal to build islands in Utah Lake was also justified. One of the big benefits they said was it would save billions of gallons of water that we could then send to Great Salt Lake. And by the way, here's a good heuristic. If anybody ever is talking about gallons of water, then it is a meaningless amount of water, right? We're not talking in gallons, right? If I were to tell you that I'm 184 centimeters tall, makes me sound pretty tall, right? But actually, I'm only 5'12". So, yeah, we got to. So these are bad possibilities. They're starting with the third option, augmenting flow. We've got to start with understanding and conserving. And I've been really encouraged by the governor's rhetoric on this. Right? He said this in the summer of 2022, on my watch, we're not allowing the lake to go dry. That's the kind of accountability and leadership that we need, right? And in 2023, the spring of 2023, he talked about emergency releases of water from reservoirs, that we only had 5 years before the lake was gone. But if we look at the rhetoric now, it is concerning. And again, I think that we shouldn't be just looking at what people are saying. We should be looking at what they're doing. And there is good progress that's being made. But the rhetoric now is, oh, that 5-year thing, laughable. It was a joke. Everybody knew that it was a joke. And I feel better about the lake than I ever have before. Right? And so I have, in the past, felt really discouraged. And in fact, after last year's legislative session, I was just beside myself. I made the mistake of describing their efforts as a nothing burger while on the phone with a journalist. It turns out that when you use a phrase like that, that's the part that they pick out of the conversation. So yeah, I was really, really discouraged. My feeling this year, because we got a little bit of a nothing burger again from the legislature. Not a total nothing burger. There were some good changes. And I should be clear. One of the things that I thought was really not helpful was the creation of a Great Salt Lake Commissioner. It looked to me like greenwashing. Like, we can really look like we're serious about this without actually expending much money on it. And I was wrong about that. Having Brian Steed as the Great Salt Lake Commissioner has absolutely changed the fight. And you keep on using this football metaphor. He's the quarterback, right? He can't do all the things himself, but he's calling the plays. And it really does make a difference. And we saw that this session. There was a proposal to fund the Bear River development. And this proposal didn't come from just anybody. It came from the president of the Senate, the second most powerful person in the state. And guess what? It didn't end up in the law because they heard from hundreds and thousands of citizens all over the state that called them and said, hey, I heard that the Bear River development is back on the table. Are you really considering that right now when the lake's in so much danger? And they said, oh, no, of course not. They backed away from that. It ended up not in the bill. It's a huge success. So it looks like we had a step back with SB 211. It was this generational water infrastructure investments. right? That is, it kind of creates the anti-steed, somebody who's out looking for more water. But actually, I see it as a huge success now that we know what went on behind the scenes. That happened because we were organized. So if you're feeling frustrated because we're not moving fast enough, I want to invite you to join the movement. Right? We are organized now. And I feel better about the lake than I have in years, both because of the miraculous snowfall, but also because we are watching, we are acting. So Grow the Flow is seeking to draw people from all corners of the watershed, which includes Idaho and Wyoming, to have this profound and lasting change in culture. Our goal is to replenish the lake above 4,200 feet by 2033. So again, we're aiming for that 30 to 50% reduction in consumptive water use. And our theory of change is that policy and individual behaviors is actually just the top of the pyramid. It's a reflection of our values and our cultural changes. And we think that we have the cultural resources to really implement this lake rescue. So we're working to write the bills, to vet the policy, and then to have a public action network of 100,000 people that can hold our leaders accountable. Because remember, our leaders don't lead, they follow. And this is actually the structure of our government. They are meant to follow us. And so we have to lead. And I think that that's a real place of empowerment, where we're not angry and shouting at somebody else because they didn't do the thing. If they don't do the thing, then guess what? We have to do the thing. That's just how it goes, because we have to save the lake. So I'll skip over that. And here, the growtheflowutah.org is where you can sign up. We need whatever your skills are, we need them. And it's been amazing. Every day almost, somebody else reaches out, somebody who I didn't know existed. And they said, hey, I work in film. Let's have a showing of the giant brine shrimp horror film from the 1970s out on the dried lake bed. So the community can come see and celebrate, right? Or I'm a student here at UVU, and I want to start a chapter of Grow the Flow to get water to the lake. So come over here. Eliza is the Grow the Flow lead today, and come sign up. The conclusion that I have is that the stakes are high. No one has succeeded before. Conservation is the only tool. And when I heard the most troubling thing this legislative session was a line that I heard from multiple people, which said, we don't want to put all of our eggs in the conservation basket. And this to me is kind of like if you had a fixed income and you are running a budget deficit and you said, I don't want to reduce my expenses too much, right? Like that, I don't want to work in the saving money basket. No, this is the basket. This is what we have to do. And we, talking about all of us, must respond with a profound and widespread awakening. And so some of that is internal to what we're experiencing. Some of that is talking with our friends, neighbors, and frenemies. But it's got to be us, so that we can shift from how much can we take from the lake to a view of how much can we give to replenish this life-giving and irreplaceable lake that is our home. And we've done this before, actually. This is a picture from 1930 of a debris flow in Centerville, Utah. These debris flows were being caused by overgrazing. And the way that we went to solve the problem, this is during the Depression, right? The Civilian Conservation Corps. We went up to change the mountain. Has anybody seen the terraces, right? Most of our mountains here. Well, newsflash, that's over here on the mitigation side of things, controlling nature rather than changing society. It didn't work. The debris flows kept on happening. What did work is we reduced the number of sheep that we were grazing in the mountains. And when we did, nature responded, the vegetation grew back, the soil was stabilized, our aquifers started to refill. We learned to live in harmony with the place that is our home. And so that's what we've got to do. Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if I have time for questions, but if you want to submit any questions, you can do that here.